few years ago now, and her great-grandparents were interviewed by Dr. Paredes, and so that's the first time she got to actually hear from them, because they passed before she was born. And
oh, so, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
So I'm like, I've never had that.
Yeah, I know, the connection.
Okay. So this is Angelica McGee.
Sebastiano Cocco.
We're with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and today it is November 26th, 2022, and we are interviewing
Patsy West.
Patsy West. Okay. So, can you tell us a little bit more about where you grew up?
I grew up on Tide Creek in Fort Lauderdale. It was an acre property that had a house my father built and my grandmother's house, which my father and grandfather had built in 1924 and had moved down to the property once they acquired it in the 30s, I think it was. And Daddy had come back from World War II and wanted to build a hurricane indestructible house. So it was of block concrete and jiggled concrete mortar. So it withstood, and of course it did withstand, and it still does withstand. So, but the water came up out of Tide Creek, so we had to move north, and we moved here to Gainesville, which has been a very nice transition because I've always loved Gainesville. But I had lived there on the property for 70 years.
Wow.
Difficult move.
What was it like growing up in that area? Like, what kind of things would you guys do for fun, like, as far as like fishing or stickball and different things like that?
Well, my father was a native as well. He was born in 1909 within that neighborhood of Riverside Park. And he was an avid skin diver. And so I learned immediately.
What's a skin diver? What's a skin diver?
Oh, a skin diver. A skin diver is someone who goes to the ocean and goes spear fishing with a spear to catch fish, rather than fishing from the coast.
And so he taught you how to do that?
Oh, yes. I mean, he didn't teach me. There was no teaching. I just learned at his side. And he made what we call Hawaiian slings, which is at first it was a steel, and then it became stainless spear with a barb on the end, and it was controlled by a piece of bamboo and rubber, like a rubber band thing. It was surgical rubber, and you'd pull it back and let it go, and it was very accurate and very good and great for coral reef fishing.
Could you tell us more about your lineage as far as mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, that kind of stuff like that?
My South Florida family went back to 1887. Wow. My great-grandfather was William Freeman and was known as William Freeman of Little River, which sounds kind of medieval. But it was so sparsely populated back then that that was an important thing, just like it was in rural England back in the day, to know that the go-to was William Freeman of Little River, gave you the name and the place to go to. And so all the scientists like Charles Barney Corey that studied the Miccosukee people, he came down to meet with great-granddad from the Field Museum in Chicago. Wow. In the 1890s, and they worked together, and he credited great-granddad with the majority of his work. And that's sort of how I got into this, I think. It was the history of the family.
What about his wife?
His wife, I know very little about. I know she made good biscuits, and she took very good care of the Miccosukee people, the Ilapashnichati that came to the house. She fed them all the time, took great care of them. And the kids, liked her very much, but it's kind of different than it is today. I'm not sure that they really knew their mother well. It was one of those kind of, you had kids, and the kids did their thing. So I never remember hearing much about how my great-grandmother was. But I'm sure she was a good person, and she did take very good care of the Ilapashnichati that came to camp at the landing, so in Little River. So that's about all I know about her. My grandmother was Ethel Freeman West, and she was born in November 29th, 1888. So she's the one that instilled in me all of my initial knowledge about the Lapashnichathi, which is the term that they use today out of the linguistic office. It means the people who speak the language, which is very important today, but also very, very important centuries ago.
Why is that?
Centuries ago, when a temple mound got too populated, or the resources started to dwindle around the area because of a large population, they would choose a leader and take people from all the different clans that wanted to go find a new place to live. Now, they would always be connected. It wasn't like there was any hard feelings. It was just a population custom. And so they would go out 6 to 12 miles away. Let's say we don't have an accurate number of miles, and there may not have been, to some place where there was water, because they really required water. And they would start a new town. And when they did that, they would literally carry the fire from the original town very ceremoniously, with people carrying a pot with the fire in it, and men tending the fire and feeding it so that it never went out. Because that is a custom, a very strong custom that they had up until very recent decades. In that manner, you got a brand new town. But the trick there was that, and I'll tell you this story because it makes it more understandable. So this group went through that whole process of moving the town, and they decided to go back to see their relatives and friends. So they walked all the way back, and the people said, "Well, how was it there? How is it? What's it like?" And they said, "You would not believe. There are more hogs than there are alligators." Mm. And of course, for us, we think, okay, well, what's the puzzle here? The puzzle here is that was after 1540 when De Soto came through. And Hernando de Soto, the explorer, brought with him Spanish boars, pigs, hogs. And I have been told by people who are biologists that lineage is still in the hog population in Florida woods today. I've eaten it. Mm. So anyway, those people took that name, Mikoshuki, Hog King, as the name of their town. So now you've got a town of something, we don't know the name, and a town over there of people called Mikosuki. So if you use that term, Ilapashnichathi, it means the people who understand the language. So that means that those two towns, even though they have different names, will always be the same people. Mm. And everybody will know that. And that would have made it so much easier, because now that has actually given me, and we've had other people, Charles Hudson, Jerry Milanich, a lot of different scholars trying to put the Hitchiti people in their place. Where do they belong in the Southeast? Well, the Hitchiti people are a large group of people. They live in Georgia. And what this means is those people are connected with the Mikoshuki because they speak the same language. It's changed a little bit over time because of the not closeness of those two tribes, but that proves that they are the same people. And why we have this term that's used, so it differentiates between, or does not, it makes everyone equal, Ilapashnichathi. If you understand the language, then you belong. And you are also of the same fire, because that fire has been taken from the old town to the new town, and you keep carrying that through. And you're never supposed to let it go out. At the corn dance, which happens once a year, they say in the little moon in June, but it varies a little bit, of course, which is also a mound builder, sun worshiper, the last visage of that culture on the ground of the corn dance, the way it's laid out. But those people who, oh heck, I forget where I was going.
You were talking about the fire.
Oh, okay.
Lit. Yeah.
All right. The fire is always put out at the corn dance annually, and a new fire is built, and it's taken to all the different clan people so that that's there. Now, in the old days, when my family was there with the people, they would arrive with, and nobody made note of this, this was just normal, this is the way it happened. They would arrive with their coals in a pot. That's the coals that they brought out of the Everglades or from Pine Island, wherever it was, because you're not supposed to let it go out. So they would bring it with them, cook on it, take the new coals, put them in the pot, and go on off back to home. But they'd carry that in their canoes or anywhere else, and that's been very well documented in South Florida. I mean, thank goodness they did, because it was an everyday occurrence. It was life for the Miccosukee people, for the Ilapashni Chathi. And so all of this connects back to the mounds and the sun worship. There's also another thing that probably my great-grandfather experienced, didn't bother to say, because he didn't like to call attention to other people. That's why he never went to the corn dance. He said that he didn't want to sit and watch someone else's religious activities, that didn't seem decent to him. And so he didn't go to Pine Island to the corn dance. We had an open invitation. Our neighbors went, but they didn't go. And so he wouldn't have logged any of these things that he witnessed, like the men stripping down to their loincloths and going down to the river to praise the sun in the morning or anything like that. He just wouldn't have done it out of courtesy or whatever you want to call that. And
What about your father?
my father was an only child, and he was, we always call it the Freeman scientific gene, because we all have it, and my son Jonathan has it very strongly. My daughter Catherine is more of an artist and writer. But there's that science gene, so I sort of have both. But Daddy was a born scientist, and he became an electronics engineer for Savoy Electronics, and actually had some of his crystal wafers about the size of my pinky nail go to the moon once. They had a job for the government, and he wasn't supposed to talk about it at all, but I ferreted it out of him. But anyway, so it was really neat for him because he had that much connection to NASA. You know, today he'd probably be with NASA, but he was very, and he would take me out to look at the moon and eclipses, and built me a telescope. I still have the mirror. It was a 9-inch mirror. It was a really decent scope. And that's how I grew up. You know, I learned about tides. I learned about fish. I was wanting to be a marine biologist at one time, an ichthyologist, actually, fish, at one time. But he was just great because he was fertile. You know, he would read science news and all that, and just and explain all of that to me, even from a very young age. So I absorbed it all.
What about your mother?
My mother was a girl from Atlanta. She went to private schools, and Granddaddy had a hunting and fishing shop before its time. You know, we have those today, but before it really wasn't very popular. But a sporting goods shop that even had a underground rifle range.
Wow.
And he lost it all during the Depression.
Oh, wow.
Because he had taken on a partner who was not honest. And So they came and stayed in Florida then, and that's when my mother met my father. My father at that time was a lifeguard with Casino Pool in Fort Lauderdale. And Mama was tumbling down the beach in her umbrella, you know, her big beach umbrella, and Daddy caught her in more ways than one. So they dated for a long time, and then they got married. And she moved to Florida for good. But it's quite a stretch for her because she was, let's say, groomed for society in Atlanta. And in Fort Lauderdale, everybody just sort of ran around in shirts and tank tops and went to al fresco lunches. So it was quite different for her. But she had that other side too, and she was a dancer. She was a ballet dancer.
Oh, wow.
But it was very early, before the Atlanta Ballet was actually formulated by Dorothy Alexander. But she still kept up with all of that. So they were both very interesting people and very wonderful parents.
Did you mention if you had siblings?
I had a brother. He was Down syndrome, which was a revolutionary kind of thing back then. We really didn't know much about those people at all. There was no school. So my mother started a school because it was known then. We had no internet or anything back then, so it was word of mouth. And what we learned was that those children could be taught in most cases, in many cases, but you had to have them in a school where they were receiving the right information and stimulus. So my mother and a few other mothers started the Broward School for the Retarded. That was an okay name back then. And it was in an old hotel called the Maxwell Hotel in downtown Fort Lauderdale. And it was an old rickety place. If there had been a fire, they would have all gone up. But that's all they could afford. And the United Way and the March of Dimes were all behind them at that time. And they literally built a school for those kids. And of course, that also had the autistic and other people that needed extra help, special needs. But my brother was super, and he was teachable. But my grandmother worked very, very hard with him. And I feel like that a lot of his training came from her. At that time, her husband had passed, so she didn't really have anybody that she could take care of. So she, living in the house just a few feet away, would take my brother at certain times and stuff. But he was grand, and I kept him going till 62 years old, which is extremely old for a Downs. We did everything we could for him, and he could play with his toys, and he could talk a pretty good line, and if you all came over, he'd be really glad to see you and would want to shake hands. And I can't explain it, but he was doable, and we loved him to death.
Was he older or younger?
Younger.
Younger.
Yeah.
Would you mind describing first how you met your first husband, and then some of those experiences that you guys had together with the tribal dancing and singing and stuff like that?
Yeah. I met, okay, my neighbors had a boat business, and I graduated from Florida State in 1970, but I had no prospects really. We had one art museum in town, and they didn't want me. And matter of fact, they wouldn't even let me look at their African collection because they didn't have the outreach to have somebody come in and do that. And I was held out against him. I would talk to the director and tell him, I remember when you didn't let me come in and look at your African collection. But at any rate, where was I?
You were talking about meeting your first husband.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Okay. So shortly after that, I went to work for my neighbor who had a boat business, a small boat size business. And it was really a good business. And there was a mechanic named Wayne Bragg. And we hit it off and talked a lot. And he had 2 daughters. And I became very close to one of his daughters. And she was dating a guy named David Blackard, just casually, but dating. And David Blackard was a Boy Scout that was interested in Native Americans. And shortly thereafter, Chrissy found another guy that she wanted to date in the Boy Scouts and sort of said, why don't you just, like move in on this? And so I started dating David Blackard. And he really was a font of information because he was a very intelligent person and introduced me to Indian singing first, I believe. And we would go out on the reservation at night. Thomas Storm was out there. He was a younger guy, and he was just learning to sing. He was a Miccosukee Seminole. He was an Ilapashni Chati. And David was an accomplished singer. He had a mind like a medicine person or something. He could remember hundreds of songs, literally. And he became one of the, let's say, 5 top white singers, they called them the White Boys, in the United States. He could go and basically anybody would let him sit at their drum and sing, and then would say, boy, you really did those Punkah singers proud, and shake his hand at the end.
How did he get involved with the tribes?
Just by that, really. Just by that. That's how I met James Billy, the former chairman that brought them their prosperity, was just being on the res, just being out there. We had friends, we'd go to their houses. I had a girlfriend that we went out west with once. Just being there. There was no closed gates or anything, which reminds me that there were gates once on the entrance, and when I was about 4 years old, Betty Mae Jumper and some of her kids, she was the only female chairman that I wrote a book about with her, ran into our car and bloodied my nose. And I told her about that just about one of the last times I ever saw her. I said, Betty, did you ever have an accident outside the reservation? She said, yeah, I did. I hit a station wagon. And I said, well, I was in it. So there have been a lot of things that have been coincidences like that. But anyway, we were just kids singing on the res. I don't remember James ever singing with us, but we'd get out there and we'd talk and we'd start talking about all kinds of stuff. But we were in and out of houses. I mean, they came to my house, I went to their house, back and forth. And so anyway, David then took his first girlfriend, Claudia Shiner, and I on a trip out to Ponca to go to the Ponca powwow. That's in White Eagle, South Dakota. White Eagle, Oklahoma. And that was the first time I'd really been out west to a reservation. And Harry Buffalo Head was a fantastic singer. I have a card that said he could sing for 4 weeks and never sing the same song. And I believe that. He was deformed, and I never knew why. It might have been a childhood disease or something. He kind of was humped over. And he would bead on a leathery pillow kind of thing. He was a great beater. He made that belt right there. That gourd stitched on the belt. He made that and gave that to me. But he would bead and sing at the same time. He had a recorder right there. And he would be brushing up because the Ponca powwow was 3 days long. He was the head singer. And it was, it was fantastic. And what drum was there? Do you know? Was there a drum that was there by name?
No, we're
at the
not sure
powwow?
by name.
Who was singing?
There's perhaps a southern drum is the only thing I've ever heard.
Okay, a southern drum I would believe because they don't dance northern.
It was competition style.
Right, but what I mean is those people that were singing at the drum have a name usually, and that's what they're known by, is whatever their name is. So anyway, the Ponca drum is very well known, have cut at least 3 records on Indian House label. They're in the Library of Congress, of course, and Harry has been at the Library of Congress before. So they are documented, so that's good. But, you know, we stayed with Harry in his house and, slept there, bought groceries. That was usually what we did, was we would buy so that we would, that was what we did for the family during the powwow, because sometimes they'd have big feeds and stuff. So we'd buy, a lot of flour and everything you make fry bread out of, or meats or whatever, But that's how that was. So that's how I started with David Blackard, was going to powwows. And we actually had teepee poles on the truck. We had our own old scrubby teepee. We went to Lower Brule Reservation that first year, and I think you had asked before, how did people take us? And I said, we knew what we were doing, so we were accepted because we knew the protocol. That's the best way to put it, really. Back then I remember Thomas Males was a very wealthy man. I don't remember what he did for a living, but he brought sod for that powwow because the Lower Brule Reservation is near a reservoir and there'd been lots of water. So he brought sod so that we could put it on the dance floor, the dance arena. And then I remember the next night we moved to a gym because it was pretty messy. But I remember he was there. He wrote a big, thick book on the Native Americans.
Wow.
But anyway, it was, flying by the seat of our britches. We were Florida kids, and we wanted to go to a real powwow, not just the ones that we had. We had a group called the Florida Indian Hobbyist Association. Louisiana had one, Texas had one, and most of these people were former Boy Scouts that went into the particular area of it called Indian Lore Merit Badge or something, and they learned about all of this. But of course, all of these people that I was with had gone much farther. They wanted to be powwow people. They wanted to know people and get knowledge of songs and the culture of the reservations that we went to and that kind of thing. That won't happen again. That part of scouting will be X'd out, It's not needed anymore. And the Florida Indian Hobbyist Association is now called the Florida Indian Heritage Association. They usually operate out of Fort Pierce, and they do have, a number of Native people that come to dances, whether they belong to the organization or they just come to the powwow annually. I was asked to go a couple of years ago because I was one of the powwow princesses, and they were getting the princesses back together. It's an honorary. You were elected. Mm-hmm. And but anyway, what that means is that at that point we have a certain knowledge of powwows, protocol, that kind of thing. And the only reason I don't go to powwows today is it's a long way out there. And all of my friends, unfortunately, are elders and they're dead. Mm. So I have no one to go to be with. And at that point, I was taken to the drum by Lucy Cries for ribs and paid for my right at a powwow north of Ponca. And James Billy took bingo to the Ponca. Mm-hmm. And a woman who was a non-Indian told me what a saint he was, how wonderful that was for the people, that nothing was the same after that.
What's a sainty? What's a sainty?
A saint.
You said told them what a saint was, or told them what was the word you used?
Gee.
She told them what something was, and then things weren't the same after that?
Oh, what a saint James was, James Billy, for bringing bingo to the Ponca. Because here you are on a reservation and you're totally impoverished, just like the Seminole were until James. And that makes a big difference. The government does what they can, okay? Sometimes they don't do it in the right departments or however, but they try. They don't get it, but they try. But with them having money themselves from James is bringing bingo to the tribe, gaming, now they can have what they need. It's as simple as that.
How did you begin translating your interests, more than interest, but your experience, your connection with the tribe into writing?
I was curator at Miami for 5 years. And during that time, I had met Buffalo Tiger. I had been to the corn dance when I was only 23 years old. I had been invited by Uncle Pete Osceola. And so I understood. I understood more than I even knew I understood. And I was buying crafts for the museum with their office manager for the gift shop, which is how the museum made a lot of money, really, because bringing in the Seminole component is part of Florida history that everybody wanted. So that was great. So I quit the museum. I was curator, and of course I had accessioned their collections and seen what they had and so forth. And I had started the Seminole Miccosukee Archive while I was at the museum. Nobody ever contested me. We had a Xerox machine, right? It was huge. It was this big square, and we had to take lessons to learn how to use it. It was the latest thing. It was great. It took up most of the office. So what I did was they had 3 files of Seminole photographs, and in order first to bring them home and show my grandmother, who was still alive, do you know any of these people? Oh yeah, I recognize them, but I just don't know their names. So I made photocopies of those 3 files of photographs. And they were early, like 1890s,
Wow.
1900, 1910, 1920s, and into the 20s with Claude Matlack, who a relative of mine, my godmother actually, had actually worked for. So with those photographs, I had 3 great big ring notebooks, great huge rings. And I got a machine, just to punch the holes in them. And I took those out and asked Howard Tommy, who preceded James Billy, if I could possibly set up at Seminole Fair. I wasn't selling anything, so I got to do it for free. And I got people coming to me, looking through those books, and I had cards made, so I could write the information. And that was both an icebreaker, and it made them happy. The families could say, look, there's your great-grandfather. They really couldn't go back that far, but they kind of could. And so that was a big hit. I was asked to go to family reunions. I was, really, because it was, even if they didn't know the people, it stimulated conversation in the Miccosukee tongue, in Ilapashni. So I wasn't privy to that, not because they were being secretive, but because they were talking to their relatives. But it was great, and that's how I broke in, really, and spent a lot of time. And I remember I was there for years, every year, for years. And finally, I got my own chiqui, and Billy Cypress, the museum director.
Chiqui, what's that?
Oh, thatched hut at Seminole Fairgrounds. And Billy Cypress used to bring me coffee every morning, and we'd talk, because he was with the museum by then, so we had a museum and my photographic booth together. And the most important one I ever did, and I wish I had done more, but mind you, I was raising 2 children by then.
Oh, wow.
So it was a little difficult, and there was my mother who was there, and father, but still, listen to the kids. Oh,
yes,
whined.
Please.
They really whined, that was a bad deal what I did. But I would take, I decided to do an exhibit on alligator wrestlers.
Wow.
Themselves, the men. It was outstanding. They would go home to the residential area in Hollywood and bring back these extremely old men in wheelchairs.
Wow.
To see their picture on the wall. And I wish that I had done that earlier. You never really know. That was something, of course it was my dime, that did it. I didn't get paid to do that. Didn't get paid to set up or anything. And maybe it was just the time situation and the fact that I would have had David, who was very handy with equipment, cut out mounting things so that I could mount them. And he also made me these big frames that I could set up. They were heavy, but I mean, I'm strong, so. And I'd set up this sort of accordion show with the pictures on the wall. And it was good against wind too, so I could set it up anywhere. So I would go to Pine Island or wherever I needed to and set up my exhibit. There was just gives of a pictorial history basic of the Ilaposhnichati. And I did that for years. For any occasion that I could, I did. So.
And then is that what transitioned into you having, don't you have a picture book, a book with like different photos?
Oh, I do, but that wasn't until 2007. So that was many years later that I put that together. There's one of postcards and there's one also of original images, just general. But that was hopeful in getting people to understand that they exist, and in South Florida. And living here in Gainesville for 3 years as I have, I understand why there was so little work done from here to the south. And the reason is mainly financial, because there were no institutions to the south where anybody from, let's say, Gainesville could go and do work without spending a huge amount of grant money, let's say, or something. And nobody did, really. I mean, archaeology-wise, yes, some people went down there to do, but generally speaking, it's been Bob Carr, who's a native of Miami, who's done all the archaeology work, whether it was the Miami Circle or whatever. And I was in on the beginning of that because the former curator, before I took over in 1973, of the History Museum, had gone down to look, because he was sort of an amateur archaeologist, had gone down to look at the area where they were tearing down a hotel called the Patricia, and he found some stuff, and I got him to alert Tallahassee. I think I was the one. It seemed like that's how it went, because I knew the people in Tallahassee, having gone to school there. So he got in touch with Sonny Cockrell and Ross Morrell. Sonny Cockrell was known for War Mineral Springs archaeology, underwater archaeology, and he was extremely dedicated. But those guys got us sort of connected so that we could have an archaeological dig there. And, you can't shut down downtown Miami progress. I mean, I understand that right now the sites of the Miami Circle, which are so blinking rare, are really in jeopardy. Some of them are under buildings where, yes, archaeologists could get in there. They left a crawl space. But to me, they're monumental. Even though it's just a flat ring now, they are monumental of someone's monumental endeavor. And we don't have all the connections to that yet. So why in the world ruin our chances? Anyway, I'm sorry, off on a soapbox.
That's okay. So what is your writing process and how did you develop it?
You sit down and you do it. No. It's a couple of things. For a number of years, let's say a decade, I think it was a decade, I wrote, and this again was an outreach of the archive, I wrote a biweekly Seminole Tribune newspaper article called Reflections. I have 200 and something of them. So those are going to get integrated as needed, as topically needed in this book on the Miccosukee. Some of them are still up on the tribe's website. I didn't get paid for much of the series. I finally sort of demanded a little bit because I needed it just to get reproductions made and stuff of photographs or whatever. But
what sort of topics?
Every topic, everything. Sometimes I'd bounce it off of a museum exhibit. Like there was something called the at History Miami, it was called something like The Slave Ship Speaks or something like that. And I would use that as a segue into something else that was, something that could have been vital or was vital that we could have known about. I did Hillis Hadjo's trip to England in 1815. I taught that when I was teaching school. I taught school for James Billy's office for 5 years with my curriculum, Seminole History, at a Futchke charter school. And the one thing the kids all remembered was Hillis Hadjo teas, because, you know, you've got kids from pre-K through high school. I taught in one day all of that. I don't know how I did it. I did it for 5 years. I mean, that is a ridiculous curriculum.
You mean 1 day a week?
1 day a week.
Okay.
But 1 day a week, all day, and watered down till all the way. You know, it was like I would make coloring pages. You know, so there was a lot to do between college, let's say watered down college, and the little kids. But anyway, we got through it, and they loved it. But the Hillis Hadjo's teas were so important because I personally had not known that we had a diplomat to England. And I felt like they needed to know that. You know, this was important stuff. He was trying to get King George to ratify a treaty, a number on a treaty, number 9, that would have given the southeastern Indians back 200 million acres of land that Andrew Jackson took on a whim after the Red Stick War. It was like, you guys were bad, so I'm taking this land. And the English wanted very much that land to go back to the natives because they knew that was not what they wanted for the natives. So anyway, but I thought this was, you know, this is international business, folks. And they didn't know there had been any international anything at that time. So I took my own family, English China, Pink Bristol, down, and we had tea. And pretty soon we had tea twice a year. But I guarantee you, if any of my students, I'd say, hey, tell me about Hillis Hadjo, they would be able to do that. That was a great treat. So anyway, that was that. And then my family had a major hand in opening James Billy's Atataki Museum. It was something he wanted very badly. And David Blackard, my ex-husband, became the first director. And it was a job that was meant for him. And because he was an authority also. And by that, I don't mean that as a bad word. I mean that he studied very hard. And so we literally designed the museum. I mean, there was a company, but you know, but they had the last say on where things went, how it went. I had items there from the collection, I think at first, if I recall, and then they got turned out, and you know, things went back to them. I think we had a friend of the family make clothing for a huge group of corn dance people. I can't tell you right now, but it seems like there were about at least 20 people. Mannequins made off of people's faces, so if you had known them, you would have recognized them. Dorfman was the company. And then the clothing was all made by Helen Rubin, who was working for David Blackard and making those items to his specs. Sometimes we dye the fabric to make sure it was the right color for the right period of time, which was around 1890. So it was a big job. It was a family job. It was a divorce maker probably, but it came off, and we did it and did a good job for James. So, and Billy Cypress, who became the first executive director. It was good.
During this process, had you already had your 2 children?
Oh yes, the 2 children were laying glue dirt underneath what would be the mannequins, but of course they weren't there. There were vignettes, and the Smithsonian wanted, especially since it was in South Florida Everglades, where the museum is, that nothing would grow in the dirt underneath the mannequins, you know. So, I mean, it wasn't just sand, it was rocky, pebbly, whatever, but they wanted to make sure that it was solid. So I was the witch outside with the big pot, mixing the pot of glue, dirt, for my children, who actually got paid. don't, against the law for sure, they were much underage, but to lay under the mannequins.
Wow.
So that's still there today. But it was a family endeavor.
How do you think that impacted them, who they are as people now, that they got to see you guys doing all that stuff?
No, I don't think so. I mean, they're not beyond doing it, and Jonathan can build anything. And Kat is a very great speaker on many subjects, and a leader that way. But, I think with them, I mean, to hear them talk, every time I left them behind to go give a talk or something like that, they had to stay with grandmommy, and they couldn't play their video games, and, because 2 houses. Now, we should have just gotten a second unit for my mother's house, but we didn't know to do that back then. That would have been ostentatious to have had a second unit there, but anyway. It was but I mean, I'm sure the kids were very proud of us. I'm sure they were proud of the museum when it opened. I don't think they were there at opening, no. They probably didn't want to be, but anyway, we worked very hard for our very good friends, and I worked very hard for those people that were already very gone, that I had known of back in the day, and the fathers of people that I knew, and the mothers, because, my history started back before the photographic record, but with people who, who I feel like I knew even though I didn't really know. Like Squirrel's doll is a replica of Squirrel.
Oh, wow.
She lived in the Everglades. It was great. She was a great craft worker, and her daughter was as well. And that was actually Billy Cypress, the museum director's grandmother. And so because I loved him so much, I keep her out where I can see her. I won't give her to the museum until after I'm gone, because she's part of the family.
How did you meet Samuel Proctor?
When I worked for the Historical Museum for those 5 years, we may have had a meeting of the Florida Historical Society. They met around the state. And I believe we had a meeting there at the museum. It was a new museum, and it knew Miami history, but we were not Florida Museum at that point. We were very South Florida. And so to have the Florida Historical Society people, there were a lot in Miami, at University of Miami, Charlton DeVoe, who wrote the first Florida history, and other people were very involved. And so we hosted that group. And that's probably where I met him. So it was probably 1972, 73, or 74. But once we knew Sam, and I'd go to the annual meetings every year, I came up here because my college roommate lives across town. So when I'd visit her, I would just go over to Florida State Museum. That's what we used to call that area where Sam's office was. And we would all hang out there in the hall. It was right across from what they call the Poison Room.
The Poison Room?
Mm-hmm. It's not there anymore?
I don't think so.
Okay.
What's the
Well, I
Poison
guess
Room?
Not by name.
Yeah,
but-
not by
That would
name.
not be a really good come on, would it? But back then, what it meant was that it was an archival room for the collections of the museum. So that, of course, is now over in the big museum. And I don't know why it was called the Poison Room, except for the chemicals that they would have used to...
Oh, wow.
Well, and so now I'm thinking... Actually, I had a situation there once. But at any rate, that's where we were, and that's where we would hang, examining the Seminole clothing.
Wow.
And so Sam would come through, Milanich would come through. And half the time we'd go off with Milanich and go down the halls and see something he wanted to show us or whatever. But, we were just there, and we were there at least once a year. When we lived in Clearwater, it was a lot quicker. When we got married, we moved to Clearwater, and David went with Showcraft Exhibit and Design, and I did too for a while. But I started working then on writing. So I've been writing, for a good long time.
How have you seen oral history develop and change since you discovered its existence?
I don't know that I have. And I think the thing that I want to say is it's great to interview on a certain level, but when you are, I'm only familiar mostly with the interviews that are done with people who are not us. They're native, okay? And so that's a whole different thing. And that's where the thrust needs to be. People need to know they need to know the culture first. They truly do. They have to, because they're missing the whole essence. And that's what I was telling you prior about the people that were doing some of those interviews. They had absolutely no background. One even did a dissertation, and you can tell with that. They're asking questions, yes, but it's almost one of those cases where you say, well, this would almost be better if it hadn't been done. It's almost that bad. So the people who are asking the questions or getting the questions up for an interview truly need to know the culture in the best way they can today, and there's a lot more out there now than there was, on how to interview a native or find out from a native how the best way to interview them would be, or what kind of questions would you ask, meaning to them, what questions would you ask if you wanted to know? And this is what they should have done. They should have found out what the natives feel are the most important questions, because that is the essence of it. We could be completely, in other words, if we interviewed a non-Indian, generic, the same as we interviewed a traditional person, it would be almost a crime at what you'd miss. Because it's a whole different world, a whole different mindset. And that's imperative, really. It's one of those things where if you can't interview somebody to where it's of a use to them and of complete contact information to them, in other words, if they relate, they need to know what their history is if we're out of that culture and interviewing them on our terms. It ain't going to work. And that's what all the oral histories that I've ever seen have been done.
What are some of the, maybe one or two examples of some big things that you think can be missed by not doing the research properly ahead of time?
Well, research is a big deal. So it's almost like if you had questions on, do you remember when the museum was open, or something like that, that's fine. That's something that's tangible, sort of. But if you wanted to ask, here's a good one. If you wanted to ask, what did you do when you went to the corn dance and you came home with the coals, but you had a stove? Okay? That's kind of an end of the road there, sort of. And that kind of question, to my knowledge, has never been answered, and it's one that I plan to address because I have realized that I didn't necessarily miss, because I didn't do that many oral histories, but it was missed.
So we're thinking of oral history more as a research method, but it's my understanding that indigenous cultures, lots of different ones, but specifically like Native American indigenous cultures, they do a lot of oral histories within the tribe, and maybe we'll set aside like time during certain like events and stuff like that, like maybe a powwow where they would like share oral histories about their family members, like just earlier in the interview we were discussing about like your lineage. Have you found that to be true, that they have their own version of oral histories that gives the knowledge to younger generations?
I have seen very little oral history utilized the way that we consider it to be done. Oral history can be something that's dropped out of nowhere. It's a statement. And it may be able to be backed up historically only if it's an event that can be located, okay? I've run across something like that very recently, and I have found it, but I can't talk about that, but I think everybody kind of knows their family genealogy, and there are censuses with the reservations and stuff like that. But events or attitudes or, you know, things like that are personal, and I'm not sure if they would come out in an interview. I know that there are people who, like Atatürk Museum has a really great oral history program. I don't know who developed the questions. I don't know if it goes with the flow. And of course, they're very covetous of that material at this point. That's not the right word to use. They are very, it's tribal, you know. But
like privatized.
privatized,
Yeah.
and usually in native language if possible, but that's getting rarer and rarer. I don't know if that would, I mean, the person that mainly does them is an educated individual. So I'm not sure if she's using a technique, but since she's a native, I'm assuming that she knows what she's doing, you know, how she's presenting. But even then, it's very sporadic as to that answer back, because most people aren't blabbermouths like me. So so I'm not really sure. I just think that it does not hurt for a person that's going to do an interview to contact someone who knows something about the topic and see where their questions could be better. You know, in other words, more broad, a better worldview, even if it's a narrow worldview. You know, you want to find out if the sand between the reservation and the chimpanzee farm where they had a tourist attraction, were you wearing shoes? No, we weren't wearing shoes. It was so hot, sometimes my feet would get blistered. That's the kind of thing I feel that you want. You want to know what it was like to live at that time. So those are questions that you really need somebody that knows about that. You know, if it's a garage, you need to know, how is the hydraulics on the car lift? You know, did it ever stick? You know, you need to be there in person, in mind, and ask those questions, because those are the questions that are important. You will not find that out in traditional oral history, in most cases. Matter of fact, although I believe in oral history, even in Betty's book, it was only good for one particular traumatic event that was mentioned over and over again. It was not something that was every day that you'd find out something about a relative or something like that. It does not function chronologically, and it does not function for the needs of oral history interviews.
What what would you consider to be your most valuable your most valuable life's work, but to you? Would that be like a book, or maybe like the alligator wrestling exhibit? Like, what have you done?
Oh, that was a joy, but I mean, I should have done more of them. I think that I think teaching school was definitely major, even though the results, I mean, the fact that somebody did it, the fact that those kids know something about history and what history is, that they could go ask their relatives, I think that's important. But I do think that my first book from University Press, The Enduring Seminoles from Alligator Wrestling it was first ecotourism, and then it was casino gaming in the second edition. I think that was important because I barely made it. I was right on the end of 80-year-old lives. And if I had not felt, see, that was against my family's wishes. My family was upset about those particular people that we know by name, Charlie, Willie, and Sam Tommy, and, or not Sam Tommy, going to the tourist attraction. They didn't see it in the way that I saw it as industry, as actually making something for themselves to bring in, to keep them, to keep their sovereignty. They needed money, and that brought in the money with themselves being the money. And then, of course, they got the Samiami Trail villages, and they could make all the money they wanted. And they could hire themselves out to be go to an exhibition or something, and whatever. Money. It wasn't prostitution or anything. It was actual money for being there, showing up, doing the job. The women made the patchwork. They were making more money while they were being watched. That was all very good. But in my family, because great-granddad had hunted with them and all that, that was the impetus for me writing or doing that research. Because the people that I knew said it was the good old days. You don't say that if it was a demeaning thing. It was the good old days. And so those are the first people I met. That's why I wrote on that. But I'm glad I did that. That is the best thing I could have done, because in a few years they were all gone. White and Indian alone. In other words, I couldn't have interviewed anybody. So that was really good. I thought about that the other day, that I did that right at the last moment. But thank goodness, Henry Coppinger and all those people, Corey Osceola, I got to know him really well. That did it. And it's been all over the world, that book, because you could look at that in Africa. People are selling their trinkets in Ghana. I've got a picture of a guy and all the beads and all that stuff, because my friend does work in Ghana. And there he is, and he's making money. That's great,
Yeah.
So anyway, that's it.
And then for my final question, what piece of advice would you leave for the next generation?
On oral history?
On anything.
I have no idea. This has been such a weird time period. We don't know how things are going to go. How many people, in other words, I have been deficit because I haven't been able to talk and interview anybody.
Yeah.
And I do that, people I love, and it's really hard to exist when you can't communicate. Granted, there's always Zooms and stuff like that, but it just isn't quite the same. I would tell people to go to more museums, support museums, because that's really where it's at. The Smithsonian and what they do in their outreach is fantastic. But without museums and what they exist for, we don't have it. We can't produce that kind of thing. So all of my Ilapashni Chathi collection is at History Miami. Hopefully they promise to make it available on SIR's database for the world. I can live with that. It needs to be out there, and it's not because it's mine. It's because I collected it with the purpose of total. I wanted a total view of that culture, and more or less, we've got it. So, and it's the only one of its kind. But so that's my hope.
Thank you so much.
You guys are awesome. You are awesome. That was amazing.
I cannot believe the part you said. What do I do now? I press the record button again.
I just pressed stop.
Where is stop? That's how you can tell that I'm out.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were talking about the sound. Yeah, just press
This one?
record again.